Joining us. I'm Tim McDonnell. I'm a nuclear policy analyst in CNA's Strategy and Policy Analysis program. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Brad Roberts and Madison Estes to discuss a new CNA report. This is the sixth in a series of CNA Strategy and Policy Analysis web video events that showcase our ongoing work. This video, as well as all of our past videos, will be available online at cna.org/strategy very shortly. So as I said, we're joined today by two outstanding and knowledgeable speakers. We're going to discuss a new CNA report, Prevailing Under the Nuclear Shadow. First, my colleague Madison Estes is an expert on nuclear weapons policies in strategy and policy analysis at CNA. Her work centers on deterrence, extended deterrence, nuclear strategy, and arms control. She earned her BA from UT Austin, as well as a master's degree from King's College London with a dissertation on the relationship between strategic stability and the New START Treaty. She has also written for the Royal United Services Institute, CSIS, Defense One, and Defense News, and she is the author most recently of the CNA report, Prevailing Under the Nuclear Shadow, a new framework for U.S. escalation management. Also joining us is Dr. Brad Roberts. Dr. Roberts is the director of the Center for Global Security Research at the Livermore National Laboratory. Before joining CNSR and taking on its leadership, he was a professor at Stanford University, where he also published his well-regarded and widely cited 2015 book, The Case for Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century. From 2009 to 2013, Dr. Roberts served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense during the Obama administration. And in this capacity, he oversaw that administration's nuclear posture review, as well as its ballistic missile defense review. Brad, Madison, thank you both so much for being here. Our discussion today is slated to run for about an hour. I'm going to ask Madison to please lead off with a short overview of her report, as well as its main findings. Then we'll turn to Brad for comments and reactions as someone who's thought very deeply about the challenges of escalation management, both as an academic as well as a policymaker. Then we'll open it up for discussion. I'll ask a few questions to get the ball rolling, and we'll open it up to the wider audience for their questions as well. I'm going to be looking throughout this discussion for questions to be rolling in. Please use the Q&A feature that's in the bottom middle of your screen, and I'll try to get to as many of those as possible. I believe that is all as far as introduction and throat clearing. Madison, please, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for that kind introduction. And thank you to all of you who have dialed in for this webinar. We're very excited to host you today. And before I begin, I also want to make sure I express my gratitude and a warm welcome to Dr. Brad Roberts for joining us as a guest speaker for this event. We're really excited to have you here. And as Tim mentioned, I'll spend the portion of my remarks to briefly share with you our insights from our recently released report, Prevailing Under the Nuclear Shadow, a new framework for U.S. escalation management. And to start us off, I'm going to go ahead and share really the bottom lines I have for you and the key takeaways from this report. And the first of these is that escalation is a highly complex, it's an interactive, and it's a contextually dependent phenomenon that does not easily lend itself to practical solutions. There's a reason why we continue to revisit this topic despite years of study that we've already invested in it. Secondly, because of this complexity and escalation's dynamism, attempts to manage escalation will never be completely exempt from uncertainty or risk. And thirdly, the US currently is lacking a means of leveraging existing escalation concepts and theory in a way that is functionally useful to policymakers and planners. This is a critical analytical gap that I believe we must fill with some urgency if US leaders hope to manage escalation and a potential regional conflict with a nuclear armed adversary like Russia, China, or North Korea. However, while this is a serious risk, it is not entirely hopeless. This gap can be filled with the adoption of a comprehensive analytical framework that vets potentially US courses of action, or COAs, for not only their ability to bring the US closer to its key objectives, but also their potential to mitigate escalation. Ultimately, the goal of any such analytical framework will be that it can provide leaders with thoroughly vetted solutions and thereby provide confidence in decision-making being made in moments that will be rife with uncertainty. Additionally, it should serve the secondary purpose of providing some insight if there needs to be any changes or alterations to current US planning postures and capabilities well in advance of confronting a potentially escalatory scenario in order to better position us to manage escalation. So for the remainder of my remarks, I'm going to try to provide a little bit more background and tell the story of how we arrived at these conclusions, and also share some more details of our proposed solution for filling that conceptual gap. So starting back with that first key insight about the nature of escalation and how it's a really highly complex and difficult problem to tackle. This insight was yielded through our examination of escalation and escalation management literature. More specifically and relevant to this conversation, some insights that I want to be sure and share from this line of research include, first and foremost, that it's important to note that escalation is in the eye of the beholder. Whether a given act is considered escalatory really all does come down to a matter of perception. Therefore, the relative magnitude of any particular escalatory action does not matter so much as the perception of its egregiousness. Relatedly, the different modes of escalation, so for an example, deliberate escalation, where you deliberately escalate to secure certain gains or achieve certain ends, or inadvertent escalation, whereby you undertake deliberate action that has unintended consequences of escalation or unexpected consequences of escalation, will reveal that escalation is both something that someone does as well as something that happens. So this indicates that escalation is not necessarily always an entirely unconstrained force. However, its risk is definitely omnipresent. These insights indicate that for an escalation management framework, we need mechanisms that anticipate not only these types of deliberate escalation and deliberately escalatory actions, but also inadvertent or accidental escalation as well, that could occur either by actions undertaken by an adversary, as well as a US ally and the United States itself. But because of its complexity and its contextual dependency, it's important that if an escalation management framework not be overly prescriptive, as each scenario is going to differ from the last. However, on the other hand, ad hoc, spur-of-the-moment efforts aimed at managing escalation run the risk of being disjointed or even counterproductive. So it's necessary to find a way to strike a balance between providing some guiding principles and boundaries and maintain flexibility. To try to meet the mail on this, we have created what are essentially a couple fixed elements in this framework that can help frame a US approach to escalation management. And Tim, if you don't mind sharing that first graphic slide for this, that'd be great. The first of these two elements are the objectives of US escalation management and the tools of US escalation management. So irrespective of adversary or scenario, the US will consistently have at least 4 objectives in a confrontation against an adversary and a nuclear armed adversary at that. The first of these is pretty counterintuitive. That's to limit the scope and intensity of a conflict. The US does not currently have an approach to taking on total war, and probably should not in the case of confronting a nuclear armed adversary. And therefore, if we're going to adopt a limited warfare approach, we need to find opportunities to alleviate pressures to escalate and to keep the scope of a conflict at a level that matches the interests or objectives that we're seeking to protect. A second objective for US escalation management is to achieve our war aims and overall political aims at the lowest possible cost. This might be in tension with this first objective because it might require the use of or conducting of kinetic military operations to be fulfilled. So striking the balance between these two objectives is really a key challenge for effective escalation management. And then third, for the United States in particular, we have a keen interest in assuring US allies and deterring attacks on their vital interests as part of our escalation management strategy. In any regional conflict that we might face in the future, inevitably US allies and partners in those regions will play a role directly or indirectly in managing escalation, not only because our adversaries could try to leverage them against us to achieve coercive effects, but also because these allies are independent actors who have the ability to impact escalation dynamics on their own. Lastly, the fourth objective is to facilitate the de-escalation and ultimately the termination of a conflict. This is analytically distinct from the first objective because the first does not necessarily require total de-escalation or war termination to be achieved. And this particular objective really does require some more cooperation from both sides. And likewise, similar to the objectives, irrespective of adversary or scenario, the US has at its disposal 4 overarching tools for escalation management that are inevitably intertwined with one another. So the first of these is deterrence operations. And these actions can be ranging from posturing and exercises of forces to the actual employment and use of them, which brings me perfectly to our next tool, which is the employment of military force. So using military force can help us both succeed in achieving tactical and operational gains, and also serve the larger purpose of actually sending a deterrence message when we want them to. And this segues perfectly to the third tool, which is messaging. And so deterrence operations inherently seek to send a message to an adversary, and then in the case of the United States, as well as an assurance message to our allies. And this messaging can take place through actions such as deterrence operations and the employment of military force. And it can also occur through the sharing of information. So think of signaling with the publication of US doctrine to communicate the role of key capabilities, such as nuclear weapons. So nuclear posture reviews actually are a great example of this. And lastly, for the final tool, we have off-ramps and palatable alternative outcomes. This tool is really important to round out the toolkit because we can't just rely on deterrence operations and employment of military force and driving up the cost. We also have to make sure that the benefits of an adversary remaining restrained have some appeal to help them make that decision to accept an off-ramp. So thereby, this particular tool helps create the conditions to avoid further escalation by driving up the perceived benefits an adversary could realize if they do exercise restraint. So these two elements here, the objectives and tools, which are in the top and the bottom triangles, form the first two pillars of our framework. Reliance upon these different tools will shift and sometimes overlap, and the prioritization of these objectives will also shift as well over time. However, between the objectives and tools, we realize that there is essentially a wide variety of potential courses of action or COAs that could leverage these tools towards these ends. And as I mentioned earlier, we learned that it's important that we not be overly prescriptive because each scenario and each adversary and the way that they behave is going to change with each circumstance. But all the same, we felt it was necessary to create some connective tissue between these two pillars. And the result of this was our 5-phase nuclear escalation management process. And this process intended to be a means of evaluating those COAs that exist in this trade space between the objectives and tools of escalation management. And we've got another slide here that breaks that out into a little bit bigger text just so people can see it. So as I mentioned, this connective tissue is our 5-phase nuclear escalation management process. And this is the third pillar of our framework. And it also helps me circle back to our second key insight regarding escalation management confronting uncertainty and risk. So taking the findings I mentioned earlier regarding the nature of escalation, its complexity, and so on, this insight also played a role in helping us develop this process. So as part of our research, when we reviewed risk assessment and risk management literature applications to nuclear escalation as well as strategic planning, we found that first, in order to successfully manage escalation, it's important to note that the US can't solely focus on just minimizing escalatory risk. Rather, effective escalation management requires that US planners and policymakers identify prudent times to engage in calculated risk-taking to achieve mission as well as larger strategic objectives. In other words, actions involving self-restraint should not be seen as inherently good when it comes to escalation management. They need to be probed as equally hard as actions that would involve aggression. Second, past applications of risk management to national security problems, such as preventing terrorism attacks inside the US homeland, have found value in continuing to revisit ideas and incorporate lessons that we learned via implementation and prioritize feedback. So to this end, we thought it was prudent to ensure there was a similar step in any of our framework that would help evaluate prospective COAs and war plans. So this 5-phase process attempts to incorporate these insights by primarily posing a series of questions associated with each phase, aimed at identifying where risk-taking is appropriate or where risk avoidance is more prudent, and understand the operational trade-offs of these decisions. So for an example, phase 3 here, which is the analyze thresholds and flashpoints, you can see has its users take the COA being evaluated and pose some questions like, if we're going to execute this COA, what are we seeking to achieve? Are we seeking to impose an unexpected cost on the adversary? How might our adversary then respond to a potential escalation by the United States? How might an ally respond? Based on some of these answers, if we think that the escalatory risk in response to this potential escalation by the United States is too high, what might be the strategic and operational risk of foregoing the COA and trying to achieve maybe the same mean or objectives with different means? Secondarily, this five-phase process attempts to incorporate these insights also by, as I mentioned and alluded to, including a step for implementing the COA that is vetted through these first 4 phases in an interactive setting, like a tabletop exercise or a war game, to road test it before the rubber does meet the road in conflict and learn from its implementation, ultimately serving to improve our strategy prior to conflict. So together, the objectives of US escalation management, the tools of US escalation management, and this 5-phase process form a cohesive analytical framework for evaluating potential courses of action that might be implemented in conflict. This framework is intended to serve as a decision-making aid during the planning process and to encourage proactive thinking on how the US can achieve mission objectives while also keeping conflict from escalating further than our desired limits, such as past the nuclear threshold. And to conclude, we believe this framework provides a much needed tool to US policymakers and planners at the Department of Defense, as the Department of Defense aims to create an escalation management strategy that has the daunting task of being able to be tailored to different adversaries and different scenarios. With the current challenges we face as to US global leadership in both the European and Indo-Pacific theaters, it is all the more critical that we be prepared for the possibility of regional conflict that is taking place under a nuclear shadow. Ultimately, this framework can't guarantee the total elimination of escalatory risk, but I believe it is a strong starting point for bringing the United States closer to managing this risk prior to confronting it. So with that, thank you so much for attending this event and listening in. I look forward to our discussion and hearing Brad's comments and also the Q&A session to discuss this topic more.
Thank you so much, Madison. That was a quick, tight march through a whole lot of work and research that you've done. I appreciate your concision. Brad, over to you.
Tim, thanks so much for the opportunity to join the conversation. Madison, congratulations. Sorry, just dropped my notes. Madison, congratulations to you on a fine piece of work and a fine summary. And to the Center for Naval Analyses for taking this on. I need to underscore that I'm speaking in my private capacity, and I'm not here representing the views of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory or any of its sponsors. These are my personal views. This is a very substantial piece of work, as Madison's brought out very eloquently. It's important, it's timely. And as I wrote down those comments, I found myself pausing on the word timely. This is timely, but it's also long overdue. This problem has been taking shape before our eyes as a community for over a decade. A decade ago, the Obama administration was talking about 21st century contingencies, quote unquote, in which adversaries were contemplating escalating their way out of failed acts of conventional aggression at the regional level of war. The third offset in 2015 and 16 was focused on managing the problems of conventional escalation. Chairman Dunford spoke about the problem of multi-domain, multi-dimensional, and potentially trans-regional conflict as the new paradigm. And of course, the national defense strategy of the Trump administration set out the new problem, the focus on regional wars with a significant escalation potential, including in the nuclear domain, but in other domains as well. And what's striking to me is how little progress the defense community has made in coming to terms with the escalatory potential of these conflicts over a decade. There's been lots of progress, but the progress has been stymied by a widespread view in the defense community that our adversaries wouldn't dare. And you can fill in the blank that comes after wouldn't dare. But because we're the more powerful actor, they wouldn't dare nuke us or an ally. They wouldn't dare use cyber for crippling effects. They wouldn't dare attack the American homeland. The list goes on. And if they were to dare, we would turn them into a glass parking lot. Well, and the next question is, so you're going to go in and tell the president that your solution to the problem presented to us by an adversary's escalation is a glass parking lot? That might win the war, but it would certainly not win the peace that would follow. I'm very highly motivated by the findings of the National Defense Strategy Commission, which of course highlighted the absence of strategic thought in the Department of Defense and the larger defense community on problems of deterrence, escalation management, war termination, and indeed it called for a significant DoD study on escalation. So this is a very important step in the right direction, but it's a step that's long overdue, and kudos to CNA and Madison for moving forward on this when many others have apparently been reluctant. I find a number of features of the study particularly attractive from my perspective. First, it offers a corrective to the common preoccupation of people in the defense community when it comes to the escalation topic. Attention most often focuses on unwanted and inadvertent escalation. Yes, that's an important problem, and we should be doing more to think about it, particularly as we compete more in the new technologies. But the escalation that the Department of Defense needs to be thinking about is the purposeful escalation that's done to us or that we need to do to them. Not inadvertent, not unwanted, maybe unwanted, but chosen. So a useful corrective to a misfocus on parts of the escalation problem that aren't central to DoD's mission. Second, I very much appreciate the shift in the vocabulary from escalation control to escalation management. It's an artifact of Cold War thinking that we think that somehow we might control escalation. That misses the whole point. Here's a situation that has slipped beyond our control. And maybe management is the right term. I even find management conveys more confidence than I think is appropriate. We're not going to be able to manage confidence either, manage escalation either. What we might be capable of doing is countering the escalatory strategy of our adversaries. Third significant point. I like very much that the top line on Madison's hourglass chart. The fact that in managing a conflict, our decision makers are going to have multiple objectives in mind, and they are competing objectives in some ways. And what we have to understand is that our adversary, if we ever find ourselves in a conflict like this, is going to try to bring us to the point where we have to deal with the conflict in our objectives. Is our fundamental objective to avoid the next step in escalation, or is it to win something or to defend some interest? This caused me to pause on the word prevail. The word prevail goes back to, well, as some of you know, I've been stirring the pot on theories of victory. And one of my lessons learned is that the DoD military dictionary doesn't include the word victory. We speak politely about prevailing in conflict, but the political requirement is to win something. It may be to protect an interest that's been assaulted by another, but the requirement is to do more than prevail. And I wonder if people recall the footnote to this point from Leon Sloss. Leon was one of the architects of the strategy that Ronald Reagan described in 1984 as a strategy of prevailing in nuclear war. And Sloss wrote 2 decades later that while it was difficult to foresee anyone winning such a conflict, it seemed preferable to set a national goal of prevailing rather than, say, losing. Today's nuclear danger stems from the fact that one or more of our adversaries seems to believe that nuclear wars can be won because they can be kept limited. The use of nuclear weapons can be calibrated, in their view, to, quote, sober but not enrage us, to awaken us to the asymmetry of stake in a conflict, thereby breaking our resolve to continue and defend the interest that's being challenged. We need to win, not just prevail, in a conflict where we have interests at stake, vital interests at stake, including the interests of our allies. So I think this discussion of objectives is, Madison has nicely unfolded it and unpacked it and brought out the fact that there may be some choices to make among the objectives, but an objective can't be to just not lose. It may come to that in the end, but that's not an objective. Not that that's one listed in your report, Madison. And a fourth point I'd like to highlight is about the content of the decision point on escalation. When people draw graphs of the escalation pathway in a conflict, they draw arrows going to decision points, and then from the decision point, there's either an up arrow or a down arrow. This is such a grossly misleading oversimplification of the decision point. First of all, there's, in addition to an increase in intensity or a decrease in intensity, there's a decision option of just maintaining current intensity. There's also an important distinction between imposing cost and imposing risk. Risk is about anticipating the response to the cost. If I do this to X, I can expect Y result, but I might get Z result, and I want to cover that bet by doing A, by foreshadowing the cost that would be paid, by creating an image of risk. And this is an important point because nuclear weapons are all about risk imposing. If we get to the cost imposing part of nuclear war, deterrence is very substantially broken down. And I like that the and there's also a calculus there about the interests that are impacted by this choice of our allies. And Madison nicely brings out the role of alliance management as a factor in informing some of the choices we might make. Lastly, let me recount where I got to at the end of the report, which was asking myself, is it really all this complicated? I mean, that framework is elaborate, poses a large number of questions, and it's a very useful construct. It aids in concept development, planning, and in stimulating the kinds of dialogues that need to be held between civil and military leaders and between US and allied leaders. And yes, the problem is that complicated. But in my experience, it also becomes simpler the more you work with a framework like this. And in the time that on my watch in the Pentagon, when we worked with allies in both Europe and Asia to try to understand the potential dynamics of these kinds of regional conflicts under the nuclear shadow with which they now live. We had one particular ally who had 12 different scenarios that ally wanted to think through in detail in tabletop exercises. We were a little skeptical that there was all that much variety among the 12, but agreed to proceed to see what might happen. At the end of the third TTX on the third scenario, the ally said, "Oh, I get it. It's the same problem, independent of the scenario. It's how you respond to coercion how you respond to a miscalculation of your interest by an adversary. It's about how you manipulate their perception of cost and risks and the desirability of courses of restraint. So yes, the framework may strike some as overly elaborate, but I think it's appropriate to the subject. But I think the more you work with the framework, the more it's going to reveal that the problem that underlies this elaborate exploratory tool is in fact fairly straightforward and yes, manageable. And with that, let me again thank you for the opportunity to participate, congratulate Madison and CNA, and credit the work with advancing our thinking in very useful and constructive ways. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Brad. You covered a lot of ground. You pushed us a little bit further even than Madison's report covered, which is part of your ambit as commentator. For that, I'm very grateful. We're going to start off with Q&A. I've got a couple questions that I'll toss to you both to get conversation going. Thus far, we have a large number of participants, but only one question thus far. So if you could please, if you do have a question, use the Q&A feature in the bottom middle of your screen and send in your questions. And then I'll try to triage those and get us through as many of them as we can in the time we have remaining. Without further ado, I guess what I would like to do, I know that you, Madison, and you, Brad, agree on a great deal. You've talked about these issues before in the context of this report. But despite your agreement, I do sort of want to start a fight between you two and focus on the areas in which you disagree. So you both thought a lot about escalation management. You both thought a great deal about it, but you approached the problem and you framed the problem and its objectives in somewhat different ways. Madison, when we saw on Madison's slides, the overall objectives for US escalation management, the overall focus was on limiting escalation, reducing the level of violence involved in a conflict, providing off-ramps, whereas Brad, your basic framing is we need a theory of victory. And you make the point, borrowing from Leon Sloss, that, well, if you're not going to set a goal, isn't prevailing a desirable goal? And it's not that those two things are orthogonal to one another. You're both swimming in the same pond, but they are differences in emphasis. And so I want to sort of push you both to talk a little bit about why you chose to frame US objectives and corresponding solutions in the ways that you did, as opposed to the alternatives.
Well, I guess I can go ahead and start. I think that's a really good question. I mean, for my immediate reaction is I think I still don't necessarily see the way that I've framed it as being totally mutually exclusive from the way that Brad has framed it. If anything, I kind of see this potentially maybe nesting a little bit more into some of his theory of victory in terms of starting to develop a way to counter these escalation strategies. And I would argue that this does provide a means of, I hope it provides a means of doing that, because as some of my colleagues from the Russia program have astutely pointed out, if you walk into something without an idea of how you might try to manage it, then you're automatically going to be on your knees, essentially ready to concede, because it's inevitably you're going to find that the risks are just going to outweigh your interest because you're not prepared. And so I'm hoping that this framework can maybe help with some of that preparation. But I don't necessarily, I guess, see it being mutually exclusive, but it might be a little bit more of a narrow lens than the approach that Brad has taken. But I would welcome his thoughts on whether or not he sees this nesting in the way that I view it.
Oh, I think you and I see it very much the same way. I think of you build a catalog of objectives without prioritizing them, as I understood it. Arguing that in the circumstance, political leaders will make decisions about what comes first in the context of escalation against us, which is aimed at compelling that particular discussion. I also think that limiting the damage of war and preventing it crossing the nuclear threshold, and if it does, stopping it as quickly as possible, are very urgent priorities. But you put it as something like being on your knees at the start. Tim, the short answer to your question of why I put it the way I have is that every tabletop exercise in which I've been engaged, in which the blue side starts out saying our first objective is to avoid nuclear war, red wins, because almost every time, because it's able to exploit the resolve of the blue to avoid escalation. And it wins not by going nuclear. It wins in the game of coercion and gaining the interest that was being contested in the conflict. So, and I want to be clear that by winning, I don't mean engaging in nuclear warfighting for the purpose of defeating an enemy on the battlefield. Our adversaries have strategies that are informed by the conviction that they can out-coerce us. And they believe fundamentally that the underlying interests at stake are more vital for them than for us in any regional conflict on their periphery. And thus all they need to do is awaken us to that underlying asymmetry, and we will back down. And as our allies can see this today and calculate this, they will become more amenable to the influence of Moscow or Beijing. That's what winning means to them. And winning should mean that to us, should mean that that strategy of coercion doesn't work, and we're safeguarding the regional orders that we've built and commit to protect.
Sure, thank you. That makes sense. There's a powerful narrative about the balance of resolve, as well as not only your own personal experience with wargaming, but there's been a good deal of research recently about the history of wargaming and the phenomena that you note, where the blue side is sometimes reluctant to go nuclear, is fairly widespread. And so I see where your framing comes from. Going to move into questions are starting to stream in, and we've got a good number of good ones, and I may not be able to get to all of them. One simple but deceptively complex question comes from Oliver Barton. To what extent, and this is chiefly aimed at Madison, I believe, to what extent can your framework be used to understand how to restore deterrence should the nuclear threshold be crossed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, I think this is a little, the nice thing about this, if you get to use this in planning, is that you can attack a scenario like that and figure out, okay, some things already happened that we didn't want to happen. How can we then go about trying to restore deterrence and prevent further escalation, but also still achieve our objectives despite the maybe the losses that we've incurred and those kind of things. So I definitely think that there's a role for that here, and that in the aim of trying to provide some flexibility in the framework, you have the flexibility to choose your own adventure a little bit and figure out if, you know, what you might need to do to restore deterrence without accidentally spurring escalation on further.
Thanks, Madison. Brad, anything to add?
Well,
okay.
Lots, but let you make the judgment call on time here, since your time is running short and you have a lot.
Sure. Yeah, we do. Thank you, Brad. We do have a fair number of questions streaming in. From Heather Williams, Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow up at MIT. Madison, could you say a little bit more, and this also will bleed into Brad's experience as well. Say a little bit more about the relationship with allies in your escalation management process. So during your 5-phase process, how would the U.S. be interacting with its allies, engaging with them, trying to avoid catalytic escalation effects as a result of our decision making? And Brad, in practical terms, how do you manage competing allies' interests during a crisis, and whether and how that fits into the CNA escalation management process?
Yeah, so thank you for your question, Heather. I think that the way that we tried to make sure that the ally piece was incorporated in this really comes both in explicitly calling out the special role that they play in U.S. objectives and our view of I think our role in the world and as a security guarantor. But more concretely than that, in the five-phase process, we make sure that it's not just an examination of escalation dynamics between the US and select your adversary, but also that the relevant allies get noted as well. So even from starting at phase one, when we recommend that we begin by developing strategic profiles, we want strategic profiles developed for all three groupings of actors, including our allies, because this is, and I think this is a critical step that we can't take for granted, because we need to understand the interests that our allies have and where those interests overlap. And then more importantly, at what point will those interests potentially diverge from the US, where, you know, an ally might feel pressured to go at it alone, or that the US isn't going to protect them or won't see eye to eye with them on this. Because I think it's just as there's a huge trap of mirror imaging an adversary, I think we can also take for granted that we have a good understanding of ourselves and people that we have common interests with, when that's not always necessarily the case. So starting from the very beginning, at least in that five-phase nuclear escalation management process, I think we seek to explicitly call this kind of stuff out in order to kind of baseline everyone. And then beyond that, we try to pose questions in the remaining phases, particularly thinking about phases 2 and 3 that aim to uncover what potential courses of action an ally might be taking with us or even against us in a certain scenario. Where are their key thresholds that we need to hold in mind that we need to protect as well, and that we'll have a strong interest in protecting. And then if an ally wants to undertake its own actions, identifying, you know, what is that going to mean for the United States and our objectives. So we try to look at this as comprehensively as possible, to not just take it for granted that allies are going to always be in lockstep with the United States. I think that that's a fallacy that we tend to give into, maybe without realizing it. So trying to acknowledge that they have their own independent role by ensuring that they get acknowledgement in the questions, and also that their strategic interests are acknowledged from the outset as well. And also, I mean, I think that in terms of implementation and evaluating the COAs for the phase 5 and creating that feedback loop, I think if you do implement this framework, it would be my hope that there would be, you know, green players in your interactive forums that can play the game and actually inject those nuances of allied viewpoints, because I think they're very critical if you really want to have a comprehensive approach to escalation management. So I hope that answers the question. Brad, I'll hand it to you now.
Well, I think you've done an excellent job answering the question and hit on many of the points I would hit on. So let me just hit on one. And that's if we leave the management of competing allied interests to the moment of crisis and war, we've waited too long. This is work for today and tomorrow. I don't know how many allies are on the call here, but this is work that we need to do together. And if we haven't, we can be sure that our adversaries in time of crisis and war will be hitting hard at the points of difference between the United States and its allies, and between different allies. North Korea's strategy is very clearly to divide Japan off from the defense of South Korea. So my bottom line point here is management starts now, not in crisis.
Thank you both. I've got two questions that I want to throw to you that both center on theater nuclear forces. One centers on naval nuclear forces. Steve Wills writes that during the Cold War, nearly every US combatant had nuclear weapons embarked, and most were ASW weapons, anti-submarine weapons. but we also had nuclear capable Tomahawk missiles and a variety of other weapons as well. How would the return of low yield nuclear weapons to surface warships affect escalation management? A related question from Tom Bodish is specifically directed at Brad. Do you favor more options for our intermediate low yield nuclear response or fewer? Is our policy to threaten nuclear Armageddon in response to first use by an adversary, or to match low yield use with our own low yield use? Is there a nuclear stair step upward? So how comfortable are you with the current range of capabilities that we have in the existing arsenal?
Comfortable enough. Is it ideal? Could it be tailored in some ways? Perhaps. If we were starting from scratch, would we design exactly the force posture we have in being? Probably not. But can we get from here to there? Practically, politically, financially, etc. I don't see it. What's the first order question here? What do we need in the way of a credible regional nuclear deterrent? Some see the answer is the triad. Our strategic force is good enough. It can service any target anywhere in the world in 30 minutes. Another answer is we need to recreate the largely symmetric force posture that our adversaries have created, so that if they think they've got a rung in a ladder they can step up to, we've got the same rung in the one above it too. And it becomes an endless game of flexible response. I think both of these ways of thinking are unsuited to the current moment. What we need is the operationally is the ability to retaliate, a word that's not the right word to use when it comes to the use of force generally, but respond to very limited employment, which an adversary undertakes on the presumption that a nuclear shot or two will break our will to resist, will open up to us the asymmetry of stake, and we'll turn around and go home. That would probably be a significant miscalculation of our interest. We would then want to respond. An adversary would then face the choice of upping the ante, not doing anything, or terminating the conflict. If the choice is made to up the ante, would that be the move to full-scale, all-out nuclear Armageddon? Seems unlikely. Seems there'd be another, but larger scale strike aimed at sending the message that we had miscalculated their interest. But when you get beyond a couple of small-scale exchanges, in a regional context, that's going to look like, well, major war, major nuclear war. And for the problem of major nuclear war, we have in the triad a credible retaliatory force. So I see what that tells me is we have a need for in the regions to credibly threaten to respond to a couple of small scale strikes or a very few, but not to compete at every level of escalation where an adversary might choose to employ nuclear weapons this way or that way. But the whole point of having nuclear weapons is to never get there. And it's to establish the credibility of the threat, not the capability. And to establish the credibility of the threat in regional nuclear war, we need to have capability that's regionally available. We can't do this from the homeland. We have to show some skin in the region, and our allies have to have the ability to show some skin with us, because it's their resolve to stick with us in an escalating conflict that's the first object of Red strategy. And thus the sharing arrangements are much more important for the credibility of our threat than is maritime-based US nuclear power projection capability. That doesn't buy us very much leverage against this problem today. the problem being establishing the credibility of our threat to employ a non-strategic weapon in a theater contingency. So, well, I think I've given you an answer, and I'm mindful of the time.
Sure, thank you. So in general, you're comfortable with the range of capabilities that we have. You've argued, for example, in your recent War on the Rocks piece and your recent CGSR piece that I think I see behind you, that to the extent that we have gaps in the deterrent, they're not principally capabilities, they're in terms of concepts. And forward deployed nuclear weapons on warships, because they're not as tightly tied in with allies, doesn't do a whole lot to get us that credibility signal, that resolve signal that we're really looking for. Thank you. Madison?
Yeah, actually, this is probably maybe an area where I do diverge from Brad a little bit, and that I do think, from at least the angle of Steve's question about impact on escalation, there's for returning nuclear weapons to surface ships, that there's a lot to unpack there. But I do think I do wonder to myself about the credibility signal that would send. I think I understand why there's maritime based nuclear weapons have kind of, and maritime nuclear use at sea kind of gets treated differently because it's not on anyone's homeland. It might suffer less casualties, et cetera, et cetera. However, and here's me putting my Center for Naval Analysis hat on. Something I've been learning is about how much effort it would take to get that capability back on surface ships. Would be a huge effort on the part of the US Navy and the Department of Defense. What that would mean for escalation management, I think, is dependent on a lot of other first order questions as well, such as how is the US going to base it? Are we going to maintain our neither confirm nor deny policy? Those kind of things, because that'll impact, I think, a lot of the signaling and perception building we can do around that. But however, I think it is an open-ended question of what would the impact be, particularly if we were to make it known that we were doing that. So I mean, I think it has potential, but maybe I'm overselling the potential. But I think it's kind of an open-ended question personally.
Thanks, Madison. I'm going to turn to a question from Vince Manzo, now at the State Department, who's asking about the road ahead. So for Madison, can this framework that you developed help to educate senior officials about the decisions and risks that they would encounter in a crisis with a nuclear armed adversary? In other words, is there an educational component to this framework? And for Brad, how do we convince senior officials to take the time to prepare for a crisis that we all, of course, hope will never occur? You've already sort of talked about this with respect to allies. The time for alliance management is not during crisis, but now. But there are a lot of other activities outside of alliance management that senior officials will need to tend to prepare for the sort of crisis that we're all talking about.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to take that first. I absolutely see a potential educational role for this, and that is a goal or a desire I have for if there's anything that people take away from this. I would hope that senior officials are able to see escalation as being more than just about a deterrence problem. Deterrence is really integral to escalation management, but as I think we've demonstrated from our framework, it is multifaceted. There's other components to it, including alliance management, and then actually achieving your operational objectives. And so it's not to kind of widen the lens out from that. Well, let's think about how we can deter our adversaries and from escalating further. It's really important. It's probably priority number one, but there's a lot of other moving parts. And I would hope that because of the comprehensiveness and, kind of as Brad said, the fact that it is pretty complicated at first brush. And so, I mean, I would hope that would be a little bit of a wake up call of the challenges that we're dealing with, and could be utilized particularly in those wargaming and TTX type forums. I think this would be a really benefit as kind of a training tool for people to think through escalation risk in real time.
Yeah, I'd just make 2 points in response to Vince's question about how to engage leadership interest. One, if we have a leadership group that's not interested, it takes someone above them establishing their interest. This is a problem that begins, or a solution that begins at the White House. Well, it begins with the appointees to leadership positions. If they don't bring an interest to this topic and need to be motivated, they need guidance from the White House and the president. But another way to think about this is bottom up as opposed to top down, and there's a lot of great work underway now on how to think about prevailing at the conventional level of war, restoring confidence in our capacity to project conventional power. And what every regional combatant commander and service chief needs to understand is that if we are successful in the enterprise of restoring confidence in our ability to prevail at the conventional level of war, the escalatory dimension becomes all the more important. So the best route to escaping the escalatory dimension of war is either to not fight the war or to lose the war at the conventional level. But if we succeed at our ambition, then we come to this problem. This is the consequence of success at the conventional level of war. So that takes prevailing upon the combatant commanders and service chiefs to come to that way of thinking is the business of the chairman or the vice chairman.
Okay, thanks. That's extremely helpful. These are big, complicated problems, and having a clear assignment of responsibility is an extremely useful step forward. Another looking ahead question that's been preoccupying me for a while is how we deal with multiple adversaries. Just last week, the head of Stratcom, Admiral Richard, observed that we're on track to be confronting 2 different near-peer nuclear-capable adversaries for the first time in our country's history. Brad, earlier you evoked Leon Sloss, who is the lead author of the Sloss Report, which came out in 1978, I believe, which developed or promulgated this, articulated most clearly for the first time this concept of tailored deterrence, understanding what your adversary wants and then tailoring your threats to meet what they want or what they fear. How do we do that? And can this escalation management framework help with that when every signal we send is going to be separately and differently interpreted by 2 different adversaries that have different interests and capabilities and desires and fears?
Sorry, I lost my cursor. Well, recalling Madison's framework, messaging is only one part. Messaging is getting harder, not easier, in the complex world we live in. Doesn't mean that clear messages can't be tailored and received. I think well, I'm not sure that there's any significant insight to add beyond this is a hard problem. It's a part of, and it seems to me that the framework Madison has set out is useful for getting at the problem, meaning what are the particular decision points that a particular adversary is trying to create for us through its escalatory action? What are the particular decision points we might be able to create for that adversary that would compel decisions that would be supportive of our interests, and aligning capability plans and exercises to demonstrate, to align with our declaratory statements. These are the essential ingredients of effective signaling to an adversary that we have a tailored approach. But let me not ramble any further and turn it over to Madison.
Yeah, so I mean, I thought something interesting you touched on, Tim, that we haven't that we haven't talked about is the idea of having to deter two nuclear armed competitors at the same time. And I think I really appreciate something that Brad emphasizes this in his recent monograph, talking about the importance of the second theater. And I would really hope that this framework can help with that problem as well, by emphasizing, as it already does, the role of third-party actors. It's done through the view of allies, but I think that there's space to do the same thing with the second theater, and thinking about what might our adversary be looking to do while we're distracted over here. And I think that's an important question, and one that I definitely want to flag for everyone, because it's I think a key insight. So that's all I'll add on to that, but I think that's definitely an important takeaway to some of the future challenges we have ahead, is that it's going to be an all-encompassing issue.
Okay, it is now 12:03. We have, as the Soviets used to say, overfulfilled our quota here. So we're going to have to wrap this up. Madison, Brad, thank you both so very much for your thoughtful comments and for a really illuminating discussion. I appreciate your taking the time, especially Brad. It's a little bit early there, not terribly early, but a little early in California, for taking the time to join us. And thank you to everyone who dialed in from all around the world to participate and learn from this. As I said, video of this event is going to be posted hopefully in the not too distant future, maybe a couple days, at cna.org/strategy. With that, please everyone join me in thanking our speakers remotely, and take care and have a great day.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Brad.